Great. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us online tonight for what promises to be an excellent presentation, as you can tell from that fantastic title page there. My name's Rebecca. I'm the events officer at the Scottish Society for Northern Studies, and will be assisting to help deliver tonight's seminar, our last for 2024. During tonight's presentation, if you have any questions, please write them down in the chat. At the end of the presentation, there'll be time for me to read those to Jane and to gather her responses and comments. Yeah, so any questions at all, technical or regarding the presentation, just pop them down in the chat. With that said, it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, Professor Jane Geddes. Jane is a Professor Emerita of History of Art at Aberdeen University. Her latest book is Buildings of Scotland, Lothian. It's a comprehensive architectural survey, but her main interest is medieval art. She has produced websites for the Aberdeen Bestiary and St Albans Psalter as well. She's also the president of the Pictish Arts Society and wrote Hunting Picts, Medieval Sculpture at St Vigans, Angus for Historic Environment Scotland. Tonight, Jane will be talking to us about the battle scenes on Sueno stone. This research that she'll be presenting is an extract from an article published in the Proceedings of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland in 2024, which received the RBK Stevenson Prize. So without further ado, I'll pass over to Jane. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. And is that screen okay? And can you hear me?
Looks great to me, yeah.
I don't see myself in the little picture, but never mind. Can you see me? Yes. Oh, yes. Well done. Yes, thank you. Okay, well, I'll get going. So in this talk, I'm going to present a new ways of looking at the mighty monument known as Sueno Stone at Forres. Recent projects by Gordon Noble and John Borland have completely transformed the way that we interpret this complicated structure. I shall first of all introduce the monument and present some of the older accounts. Then I will discuss the new evidence, which has enabled a fresh understanding of the stories on the stone. For this paper, I'm going to explore the many challenges presented by the battle scenes on the east face. My article in the Proceedings of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland gives more detail on the monumental cross itself with its ornament and the enigmatic inauguration scene below. Then, without the commitment to publication, I want to explore in this talk some of the further reaches of Viking burial practice, where my ideas are still tentative, and I would appreciate any feedback from the particular expertise of this audience. At 6.5 meters high, the cross slab used to dominate the landscape, looking out to the Bay of Findhorn. But since the 1990s, it has been encased in a glass box, hemmed in by the Forres bypass and housing estates. In the open, it was so tall that it was hard to read. Inside its box, it is obscured by glare and even harder to understand. It is located on the outskirts of the present borough of Forres, perhaps not accidentally, more or less on the administrative boundary of the town. It is located at the road junction between the main east-west road along the Moray Firth between Elgin and Inverness, and its junction with the road to the mighty Pictish citadel at Burgh Head. Now, Burgh Head suffered a devastating attack and was abandoned at some point in the 9th century, and it's possible that Forres grew up as a safer inshore replacement. There's not a lot of helpful archaeology as yet at Forres, although there is an Iron Age fort nearby and one minor Pictish stone found elsewhere in the town. I've summarized a wide range of historical interpretations of the stone. Its name goes a long way back and will be hard to shift with the new knowledge. In 1726, Alexander Gordon, the first author to produce a sketch of the stone, claims that according to tradition, so it's already old, it commemorates a victory of Malcolm II over the Danish Sueno, that is Sweyn Forkbeard, who died in 1014 and certainly never fought at Forres. There follows a string of conflicting suggestions of events taking place at any time between the 9th to the 11th century, Scots against Norwegians, Picts against Norsemen, the Earl of Orkney against the Scots against the men of Moray, King Dubh of Strathclyde against the men of Alba in 966. And lastly, the final battle of the Scots against the Picts, the wipeout of the Pictish nation. Historians have very little secure evidence to go by, and one could say that their suggestions arise from the method of pin the tail on the donkey. Now, while some are convinced by the vivid urgency of the scenes, others wonder to what extent it even deals with real events, or if the whole sculpture is an allegory. Seller and Alcock ask if the scene below the cross might be from the Bible, but are stumped by its iconography. The Hendersons ponder, we cannot know whether anyone had the status or acumen to turn reporting of near contemporary events into art. Alcock concluded, it can tell us nothing about how warfare was actually conducted, and is instead a celebration of the principal fruits of war. While reportage is rare, we have the convincing earlier evidence of the Aberlemno stone, where details of armour and the York type of helmet, worn on the right, bottom right particularly, suggest the defeat of the Northumbrians at the hands of the Picts. The story even proceeds as a chronological narrative, ending with the death of the helmeted invader at the bottom right. This plausibly commemorates the Battle of Nectan's Mere in 865, although the stone would be carved in the mid-8th century. The reason I began this research is that we now have two major new elements of evidence to help us. Firstly, Gordon Noble was able to date the filling of some post holes around the stone, which were presumably used to support a derrick during erection. Carbon dates indicate that events took place Cal 780 to 900, 95% probability, or 825 to 85 with 68% probability. So we're looking at very significant activity in the mid to later 9th century, nowhere near the era of Sueno or Dubh. Secondly, John Borland created a definitive set of drawings using the most up-to-date methods of viewing the stone through old plaster casts and scanned images with movable light source. He was also able to reconstruct the bottom row, which you see on the right, which has been hidden by a collar since the 18th century, but was photographed while briefly visible during conservation in the 1920s. So for the first time, it's possible to analyze most of what's going on. The composition of the cross can be divided into 5 parts. On the west face, on the left, is the cross with inauguration below, an apparently blank panel at the base. On the east face are the battle scenes, and down the sides, a mixture of inhabited vine scrolls and some figures. Rather than struggle with controversy over a historic battle as the starting point, this talk instead works through layers of cultural evidence using the Bible, pictorial comparisons, contemporary secular literature, and the archaeology of Viking warfare. A key scene is the apparent inauguration taking place at the base of the cross. I've argued in detail in my article that I believe this represents the arming of David. In the book of Samuel, just before his battle with Goliath, David is brought before Saul. The king generously offers him all the royal armor, which David politely tries on and then casts off. His faith in God will protect him. The iconography derives from Byzantine models, exemplified in the series of silver plates made for Emperor Heraclius in 613 to 629, which shows Saul and his armorer, as you can see on the left, attending to the boy. Apart from the similar composition, the main clue is that in both instances, the central frontal figure is a child. Now, basic medieval convention would always make the most important figure also the largest, as on the Scone Abbey seal, which has often been compared with the stone. And here, Alexander III was only age 7 at his inauguration in 1249, but he's nonetheless shown as the largest person. The forest figure is undoubtedly smaller than his companions, in spite of his central role. The Forres artist has transformed the classical style into a Pictish idiom with the characteristically coiffed participants. A significant difference in the iconography produces a particular insular twist. On the plate, David still holds his sword. On the stone, his sword hilt is discarded on the top left, like the other weapons that are discarded below on the plate. And instead of holding his sword, David's arms are held up by the officiants. And this is the so-called Moses pose, where Aaron and Hur held the weary arms of Moses up to encourage Israelite victory over the Amalekites. Carol Farr has explained a similar multivalent image in the Book of Kells, which refers to the arrest of Christ, the position of prayer with their arms raised, the Moses victory, and Christ's victory over death at the crucifixion. So it's altogether a victory position. This inauguration gesture is repeated on the later Bamberg Sacramentary, showing the coronation of Ottonian Henry II. Here, his weapons are sheathed in embroidered cases to indicate that they are intended for peace, not war. Those sheathed weapons may represent the same concept as the sword strokes at Forres. In a blank panel that looks as though it anticipates an inscription of names, there is instead a series of grooves made by scoring blades, weapons blunted in a gesture of peace, trust, and fealty at some great public ceremony performed by the nobility. You would have to kneel in humble submission in order to make those marks. And if you go to the stone, you'll realize the position you need to take in order to grind your blade into the stone like that. In an illiterate society, such a visible ritual before assembled witnesses would count for far more than a written inscription. This would obviously have taken place after the erection of the slab, perhaps even at the moment of its unveiling. So now, moving on to the battle scene. Establishing the arming of David as a prelude to victory through faith in God provides the biblical basis for unpicking the East face. The exact story can still not be deciphered, but several lines of inquiry may bring the truth nearer. And these are reading the stone, including its layout, use of space, and biblical illustration. Then the application of the Bible as text, and then the use of early medieval heroic literature as a model for battle narrative, and finally, the archaeology of Viking funeral rites. So the first approach deals with the process of visually absorbing the East face, exploring how the mind and eye decode the composition. On sight, this is a serious mental exercise. The enormously tall rectangle is divided into 4 horizontal panels, within which most of the scenes are arranged in horizontal rows of tightly packed figures. And I know that there's a lost row at the very top, which is not worth talking about because you can't really see it. The Hendersons saw its size as emulating the columns of Trajan and Marcus Aurelius in Rome. And the size indeed has imperial pretensions, a memorial to an event of epic proportions. But the layout can be found closer at home in time and space. At Tours, Alcuin of York from 735 to 804 assembled Bibles from various regions and periods, using both early Christian and Byzantine sources in order to produce a revised and corrected Bible text. Some of his assemblage must have been illustrated, providing exemplars for the 9th century Tours Bibles. In the latter, rectangular illustrations cover the entire page, divided into horizontal frames and filled with stocky figures who proceed from left to right in a stately, well-spaced frieze, as you can see here on the Moutier-Grandval Bible. But as on the stone, in some of the manuscripts, the narrative breaks out into full-page illuminations, filled with different scenes stacked loosely around the space. The San Paolo Bible shows the storming of Jericho as a full-page melee on the left, but its scenes of David and Goliath on the right form part of a strip. Although much of the East face is startlingly original, one can spot some conventions deriving from illustrated Bible sources, particularly the clash of champions. Although there are at least 88 figures on the east face, only 20 actually fight. And in every case, it is one-to-one combat involving decapitation with sword and shield, rather than the collision of armies. The winner's guards lean in and the losers turn away, as you can see. This corresponds to many other Goliath death scenes from manuscripts like the Tiberius Psalter, shown on the right, and includes another Heraclius plate, shown on the bottom left. The largest cypress dish in that same series with the David scene of the battle scene with Goliath uniquely changes format to an arrangement in tiers and larger size. There is no suggestion on the stone that the multiple fights actually represent David and Goliath. There is no sling, and most combatants are of equal height. But the disposition of supporters and insistence on single combat with sword and shield suggest a model from biblical iconography. The literate viewer may start to read the east face like a book, top down and left to right. But on a public monument aimed at an illiterate populace, that order may not be so obvious. Alcott points out that on the west face cross, about 3 times human eye height, this impels the viewers to look up in awe, as you can see in the middle. Roman equivalents, such as Trajan's column, read from the bottom up. Reflections on the Ruthwell and Monasterboice crosses demonstrate that they can be read in various directions, the pairing of different scenes resulting in multivalent levels of exegesis depending on which way you look at it. And on the Forest Stone, the direction of events can also be read in several ways, with possibly different outcomes, even from victory to exhausted defeat. A notable feature of the battle lineup is that the winner is always on the right, and the loser, head often already detached, stands on the left with his troops turning away. Likewise, the cavalry procession and mixed maneuver, which is where my face looks like on the screen at the moment, there's the mixed maneuver happening, travel up from right to left. Consistently, the direction of victorious travel is right to left. Now, in almost all manuscript depictions, that direction is reversed. Victor David and the Israelites stand on the left, and like when you're reading, Goliath and the retreating Philistines are on the right. The Pictish victors at Abelemno churchyard drive their foe to the right. But there are 2 exceptions to this standard design, both early and late, showing that that direction is not invariable. At 3rd century Dura Europos and on the illustrated 12th century Stephen Harding Bible, Goliath is on the left and David is on the right. In Pictish art, on the other hand, processions typically, if not invariably, proceed from right to left. So I'm showing Hilton of Cadboll, and then there's the St. Andrew's sarcophagus, Meagle 1, 2, and 11, the Duplin Cross, and the Papal Shrine. The difference is that in reading a book, the eye travels from left to right. But in walking around a monument, the auspicious Celtic direction is decile, sun or clockwise, and the viewer's right hand nearest stone. And it is this decile direction that allows the events to be seen as traveling sunwise to victory. Now, while visual parallels from book illustration cover a few aspects of the forest composition, the Bible text offers signposts for the construction of a military event. The account of David and Goliath is the second source to examine, and this provides several insights, but is not an entirely comfortable fit. Paraphrasing the book of Samuel, the armies muster and Goliath challenges the Israelites to single combat. David taunts Goliath as a Gentile who defies the armies of the living God. At Forres, the leader on the west face is blessed by God. The enemy appear to be heathen. David boasts that with God's help, carcasses of the heathen host will lie around, which they certainly do at Forres. David carries Goliath's head in his hand to Jerusalem. God will hear war trumpets and promises to bring victory. The Philistines flee when they see their champion dead. Only 2 structures are mentioned in the chapter of the Bible, and only 2 are shown on the stone. The Philistines' tents, which were spoiled by the Israelites after further pursuit of the enemy, and the gates of Ekron, where the Philistines were slaughtered. This may privilege the interpretation of that conical structure, which you see upper right, as a gateway, although the possibility of a furnace will be discussed below. The forest monument may be framed, but is not formed by that battle between David and Goliath. In a similar way, Berthforth of Ramsey framed his contemporary account of the Battle of Maldon in 991 with biblical typology, seeing the hero Berthnoth as a type of Moses and the Vikings as fulfillment of Jeremiah's prophecy that the kindreds of the north would rise against the Israelites. Michael Lappage notes that about Maldon that, quote, any attempt to extract accurate historical details from this typology is doomed to disappointment. And this does serve as a caution about interpreting as history sculpture that is steeped in illusions. Now I'm going to look at heroic literature. Madeleine Cavanagh's remarks, decoding involves knowledge of the sources that were used to encode the cycle. And I've already suggested that the Bible is not a perfect fit, but actually quotations from great poems may have accompanied and explained the stone. If contemporary poetry is taken as a model, events may be episodic, and rather than proceeding in chronological order. The 9 scenes of single combat, of which 4 occupy central stage, deal with individual feats of valor within an army. The way they rhythmically repeat between set pieces of group action is reminiscent of the finest insular elegiac literature, where the struggles of named heroes are immortalized through recitation by the bard. Whereas the Dream of the Rood is inscribed on the Ruthwell cross to provide a vernacular commentary, here that local voice that sang out the names of the heroes is silent. The medieval Welsh poem Y Gododdin provides insights referring to contemporary culture. Its exact dates of composition is debatable, but its content evolved between the battle itself around 600 and the 11th century. Located between Edinburgh and Catterick, Yorkshire, and deriving from a Brittonic language similar to Pictish, it provides perhaps the closest literary parallel for the forest monument. Throughout the poem, the bard Aneurin intervenes to mention his role in perpetuating the tale of the heroes. Such a spoken or sung litany would have immortalized the memory of those champions at Forres. So I quote, about the men of Catterick, I, yet not I, Aneurin, sang Y Gododdin before the next day dawned. Although describing the progress of a doomed battle between the native Gododdin people and invading Anglo-Saxons, the poem's structure maintains that insistent drumbeat of elegies for individual warriors, but does not follow a straight narrative. Similarly, the forest scenes do not necessarily follow simple progress, unlike the obvious sequence of events at Abelemno. The repeating rows of single combat flanked by supporters echo the many verses of the Gododdin, which are linked by a chain of repeated lines, and this repetition is something very constant in the poem and on the stone. And on the poem, one of the repeated lines is, the warriors went to Catterick and battled with a cry, and there follows then a verse about the single named hero. So here's an example. The warriors went to Catterick and battled with a cry, a host of horsemen in dark blue armor with shields, spear shafts held aloft with sharp points, and shining mail shirts and swords. Rufon here took the lead through the armies. 5 fighters fell to his blades. So single elegies like that for Rufon here are given for many other named heroes, like all those fighting in single combat on the stone. The Irish Tyne employs a similar structure for recalling unique deeds of heroes in a comparably repetitive way. Some soldiers are picked out for their fair appearance, perhaps like the victor shown with the special headgear shown with the arrow. And the Tyne, a troop of white-breasted, well-favoured warrior at its head. He wore a gold crown on his head and a red embroidered tunic. A cloak of great beauty wrapped him round, fastened on the breast with gold brooch. He carried a gold-rimmed, death-dealing shield, and the spear like the pillar of a palace. A gold-hilted sword hung at his shoulder. These Irish descriptions add a blaze of colour to the clothing and weapons, a reminder that the undifferentiated troops at Forres could become identifiable by the application of paint. The Battle of Maldon is the closest in subject matter to Forres because it deals with a Viking attack in 991. The poem begins with an Anglo-Saxon muster on horseback, Berthnoth thereafter dismounting to fight, and I quote, "Then Berthnoth dressed his band of warriors, from horseback taught each man his task, where he should stand, how to keep his station. Then, there, and then when his folk was fairly ranked, Berthnoth alighted where he loved to be most, and was held most at heart among his hearth companions. Out flashed file-hard point from fist, sharp ground spears sprang forth, bows were busy, bucklers flinched. It was a bitter battle clash. On both halves, brave men fell, boys lay still. Then their single combat with the leader. Berthnoth wore hard, braced shield board, shook out his sword, strode firmly toward the enemy, earl to churl, in either's heart, harm to the other. Then they hewed him down, the heathen churls, that's on the right, and with him those warriors, Wulfmare and Elfnoth, who had stood at his side, stretched out on the field, the two followers fellowed in death. At Maldon, while some warriors fought to the death, others slunk away, likewise the losers at Forres in the central scene there. Then did the lack-willed leave the battlefield, they wheeled from the war to the wood's fastness. And later sources for the Battle of Maldon bring it even more in line with the stone. The 12th century Liber Iliensis adds that the Vikings just managed to cut off Berthnoth's head as he fought. They took this away from there with them as they fled to their native land, while the monks brought his body back to Ely and put a mass of wax in place of his head. And this then brings to prominence one particular head in the battle. These texts allow the viewer to read and even hear the stone like a petrified poem. The panels divide it into verses. It starts with the muster and the leader's address, and then come repeated single combats by named heroes, interspersed with scenes of general carnage. All these poems, however, record heroic defeats and are a reminder that defeat, as well as victory, can be memorialized. Both Seller and Jackson read the Forres story as a defeat for the local northern Picts by the incoming Scots from the south, using the visual vocabulary of the conquered, i.e. a Pictish style. But the new positive interpretation of the arming of David and reading the structure decel now point to a victory for Christians, not against Picts, but against the heathen Vikings. So this analysis has left until last those awkward items, composite scenes which do not fit conveniently into the template so far proposed. The following suggestions remain tentative, but at least offer a view different from many of the solutions provided by previous scholars. The left panel is an orgy of decapitation. On the bottom row are 4 pairs of swordsmen, in each case severing either the neck of the opponent or having done so. An arched feature at the top is best understood as a canopy with finials at either end, such as the tented canopy over the dead King Edward on the Bayeux tapestry. Beneath this are 5 corpses, wrists bound, laid out in a row with their severed heads adjacent. The sixth head is distinguished within a frame, apparently hung beneath the canopy. Forming a balanced composition in each upper corner is a horse with bowed head. Its muzzle is held by a man who, with his other hand, clearly shafts his sword into the animal's skull. His assistant watches over the back legs, that on the left possibly hamstringing the beast. Such ritualized animal sacrifice may also be taking place on the north side below right, possibly behind my face, where one man grips a floppy large quadruped the size of a hound, while behind him is a companion flourishing two swords. The feature of animal sacrifice, common in pagan Scandinavia, prompts a consideration of Viking burial practice, and its possibly unique depiction in a foreign land by Christian artists, and I shall return to that shortly. Decapitation of prisoners with the celebration of head trophies was a common occurrence in war, in this case preceded by David and Goliath, but also relished in insular poetry and annals. Singling out the leader's head for special treatment was the case for King Edmund by the Viking Ivar in 869 in East Anglia, and Berthnoth at Malden by the Viking Anlaf in 991. Confirming all these grisly literary sources was the archaeological find of 50 decapitated bodies, young Scandinavian men, buried in a pit, heads piled up away from their bodies on the Ridgeway Hill by Weymouth. And this episode probably took place in the 10th century, and DNA has shown that they were Scandinavians. In scene E2.3, 6 corpses, wrists bound, are laid out in a row on the left, their heads scattered in front of the conical structure. This is flanked by 1 man on the left brandishing a spear, and 3 on the right holding spears and round shields. A product of some sort definitely emerges from the base of the structure, indicated by parallel lines emanating from that aperture. The 7th body forms part of E2.4, his head borne by the tall victor below. The structure has attracted various interpretations, starting with a Celtic bell to a broch, a gateway, and recently a tar kiln. It certainly bears a resemblance to the drawing of a broch, namely Duntrodden at Glenelg, but Forres is far from broch territory. Another suggestion is the gateway or fortress, possibly nearby Berghead, but it definitely has some product coming out of the aperture. Ian Keeler suggested that it could be Nebuchadnezzar's furnace, and this incineration theme opens a whole new area of cultural considerations. In insular art, the fiery furnace is rarely shown. It is rather the early Christian depictions that show a rectangular shaft furnace with arched vent at the base, like the one painted at the Catacomb of Priscilla at Rome in the 4th century. But that fiery furnace is a symbol of God's deliverance through faith. The other biblical representation is hellfire, the destination for unbelievers. So the Utrecht Psalter, made in the early 9th century, illustrates 2 types of furnace, a conical beehive on the left and an open rectangular shaft on the right, both with a stoke hole at the base. Its illustration of Psalm 20, bottom left, readily applies to the pagan invaders, and the psalm says, "All them that hate thee, thou shalt make them as an oven of fire in the time of thy anger. The Lord shall trouble them in his wrath, and the fire shall devour them." The drawing shows the ungodly being herded by soldiers wielding spears, as on the stone, into the mouth of the flaming furnace. Psalm 9 is equally explicit. That's the upper one. "The wicked shall be turned into hell, all the nations that forget God." So here the hell furnace is a square tower with arched entrance into which sinners bound by the hands are prodded by a spear-wielding angel. Complementing the activities on the stone, in the same illustration is a besieged city where prisoners are being decapitated by the tall gate tower. Now, destruction of the sinners' bodies by hellfire was doubly appropriate because Vikings and other pagans frequently performed spectacular cremations on funeral pyres. This custom was viewed with opprobrium by the church. Charlemagne's capitulatio against the Saxons of 782 advised the death penalty for the perpetrators. And from here on, there is a speculation alert. I'm asking more questions than establishing facts. For purely pragmatic reasons, I'm suggesting that in addition to its allegorical meaning, that conical structure might represent a contemporary crematorium based on the technology of the simple lime kiln. With a pressing need to dispose of their fallen with some dignity, the Viking invaders performed an elaborate but efficient funerary ritual, cremating them in order to bring their bones home. There are many different sorts of evidence to suggest that this was a possibility, even though we do not have a specific previous example. So the first question is, what might have happened to all those bound, headless bodies lined up in neat rows? They could have been flung in a pit like those on the Ridgeway, but the arrangement looks more dignified than that. In some circumstances, both sides may have been so bludgeoned that some negotiated compromise was possible, which included honouring the dead. We have the example of the Viking warriors hacked to death in a foray in Estonia, whose body parts and hounds were nonetheless placed with some decorum in their boat for a full boat burial, presumably with the forbearance of their victors. Saxo Grammaticus records that the body of Harold Wartooth was rescued from the battlefield by his victor Hring, placed in a gilded ship and ceremoniously burnt, his remains being released in an urn for subsequent royal burial with his sacrificial horse back home at Liere. So even after very aggressive events like Alfred's victory over the Danes at Edington in 878, the outcome was not a massacre of the heathen, but a negotiated peace with handover of hostages and Guthrum having to accompany Alfred to baptism. Some negotiation may even be suspected on the stone. Those embracing mermen on the side look decidedly Aaronic, and the two apparently secular men holding books or documents might be like Alfred and Guthrum when they completed the Treaty of Wedmore in 886. At Heath Wood, Ingleby, there is the only known Scandinavian cremation cemetery in the British Isles with 59 barrows. It is believed to belong to the Great Army, who overwintered nearby at Repton in 873-4. Approximately 40% of the bodies lay on top of their pyre, their individual pyre, while the majority were token burials containing merely small amounts of charred remains. Julian Richard suggests that these were memorials to soldiers killed and burnt elsewhere, their partial remains being brought back to rest with their comrades. So the option I'm exploring is that these bodies on the stone were awaiting cremation in preparation for repatriation, like Harold Wartooth, brought home to Liere in an urn. Ostigord has proposed that at the several Viking Age burials in South Norway, where bones are contained in foreign receptacles, specifically Rhenish bronze cauldrons, death and cremation occurred in battle abroad, and the cleaned bones were returned home for further ceremony. At Klungahaugen, the clean bones were in an urn, and around it were cremated weapons and parts of a horse. At Lopthaugen, bones within the Rhenish cauldron were placed on top of a pyre site, so that the pyre had already burnt and the bones were put in a cauldron on top. These examples of double funerals, one abroad and one at home, are similar to that of Harold Wartooth. This has established precedents for Vikings managing to conduct some form of funerary ritual, whether inhumation or cremation, in hostile territory. The next question is practicality. How might such a funeral take place? Cremating large numbers of foreign soldiers in a foreign and hostile land was a very time-consuming process, requiring plenty of appropriate wood, correctly seasoned for fuel. An individual funeral pyre would require hundreds of kilos of prepared pine wood to achieve complete combustion, and this may not have been possible in a hurry at Forres. Per Holk has studied over 1,000 cremations in South Norway. He found that at least 60% of the bones had been roasted at temperatures higher than can be achieved on an open pyre, with the implication that some form of enclosed burning with enhanced draft took place. If some form of furnace was used, the sequence of bodies would generate a powerful exothermic reaction to compensate for the potential lack of fuel. So the furnace got hotter and hotter as you put more bodies in. Now, the Romans had been expert lime burners, needing lime for all their masonry work. Northern societies in the 9th century, with their wooden houses, had less need for industrial quantities of lime, but the technology was not lost. At nearby Port Mahomet, seashells were being fired on a small scale to produce lime for treating parchment vellum. The late 9th century lime kilns discovered at the royal residence at Lake Tisø in Denmark were circular structures 2 meters in diameter with an aperture at the base. The superstructure would be made of clay and taken down after firing. And at Tisø, they were used for making lime wash to cover the Great Hall. These would have resembled the one that I saw in Yemen, made of mud and roasted to oblivion after a few firings, and that you see the outside and the inside. This size of structure, with a stone base and clay above, and technology would be suitable to cremate bodies and would leave little trace on a battlefield after the bones and ashes were taken away. I even wonder, and Viking specialists may draw breath here, I even wonder if those beehive structures shown on the Gotland stones are not the supposed Great Hall at Valhalla with 3 entrance doors. They don't look like a hall to me, but representations of funerary kilns with stoke holes at the base and flickering flames above, like that on the Utrecht Psalter. Bodies cremated in such a kiln would then either be buried abroad, like those at Heathwood, or a sample of bones brought home, as at Lopshaugen. Perhaps the Forest army allowed or could not stop the full pageant of Viking funerary rites. As at the Battle of Malden, both sides could be too flattened to make demands at the end. My archaeological critics have said there is simply no evidence for this form of battle funeral using a kiln. My reply would be that firstly, battlefield sites are notoriously difficult to find, leaving few traces behind. Secondly, this form of mass incineration was probably a very rare action of last resort because the identity of the individual remains would be compromised. From classical times, Lucan heartily castigates Caesar after the Battle of Pharsalia, where Romans fought Romans, because Caesar left the dead unburied. And Lucan says he neither honored the dead with individual funeral pyres for Roman citizens, nor even resorted to a common mass cremation. And this rather dramatic still photograph picture is from Liz Taylor's Cleopatra, which gives a vivid impression of what I'm proposing on the battlefield. Lucan pleads, grant but one fire to whole nations, and in no distinct flames let the bodies be burnt, just in order to get the bodies burnt rather than left to the wild beasts. Panel 3 appears to expand on pagan ritual, with the bodies laid out under a canopy adjacent to the sacrificial horses. Ibn Fadlan records the most vivid account of a Viking funeral in a foreign land, observing the burial of a Rus leader in 921. He mentioned some of the features present on the stone. The corpse was laid out formally under a canopy, followed by the sacrifice of his best horses and dog, stages shown on the left and below. The Rus warrior was subsequently cremated in his boat with much ceremony. At Heathwood by Repton in Mound 50, there was a sacrificed complete horse, its bones with no sign of butchery, and the dog alongside the adult and juvenile. Sacrificed horses were also buried in Viking graves in Scotland, with dogs similarly found on Orkney. At the boat grave at Killoran Bay, Colonsay, from about 870, the horse skeleton was complete and uninjured, implying it was stabbed to death, perhaps after hamstringing had immobilized the beast. This looks similar to the activity at Forres, where the horses appear to be stabbed through the eye, while the second officiant holds the back leg. So while the furnace may show the eschatological destruction of the ungodly through hellfire, we may also be shown the Viking burial rites in their own terms, attested by the description of laying out by Ibn Fadlan and the archaeological evidence at Heath Wood. To find such an explicit allusion to pagan sacrifice on a Christian monument would be remarkable, but not unique. The Pictish cross slab at St. Vigin's number 7 shows with disapproval the Roman bull sacrifice of the Taurobolium, which you see on the right. Much still remains unknown about the Forres monument. My analysis of the cross and other ornament locates the structure firmly within the orbit of late Pictish sculpture, around the later part of the 9th century, a period when both Scots and Vikings threatened Pictland. But the evidence of pagan sacrifice identified here demonstrates that it refers to a battle or campaign against the Vikings, not between Picts and Scots. Regardless of whether the patron was Pictish or Scottish, the craftsman himself was someone well honed in the professional skills of Pictish stone carving. The sequence of events appears to be more allegorical and poetic than literal within a firm Christian framework. My approach here has neatly sidestepped the issue of naming a date or event, but some recorded options are summarized here. The total wipeout of both Scots and Picts took place in 839 and is a reminder that the monument might, like the poems, record a defeat. At the end of the sequence in 904 is a more resounding victory over the Vikings, possibly in this area, if it's Fortriu, followed by a long period of stability, perhaps a calm interlude in which to make such an investment in commemoration. That victory was for Constantine, son of Ede, king of Alba, who ruled 40 years. But there are no earlier Pictish records to broadcast their own triumphs rather than those of the succeeding Alpinid dynasty. Art historical evidence reveals a time frame compatible with the other disciplines, but pulls the subject matter towards an allegorical account, where the enemy are not distinguished as Vikings so much as Gentiles interpret in terms of contemporary Viking practice. Plucky David, like a contemporary ruler, entrusts himself to the will of God before the fight. But the battle itself is displayed by a roll call of contemporary warriors whose names would resound like the verses of a poem. The decidedly different styles on the front and back of the slab indicate an artistic milieu in transition, a Pictish artist grappling with an entirely innovative demand from his patron. The Forres Memorial, in its favoured Pictish cross slab format, influenced no surviving successors. Patronage on this scale and type of ornament appears to dry up in northern Scotland as rulership shifts from the Picts to the Scots. Maldonado calls this period of violent change the crucible of nations. In that case, the Forres cross slab, Scotland's Bayeux tapestry, stands as the anvil. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that presentation, and what a note to end on too, Scotland's Bayeux Tapestry. That was fantastic. I particularly enjoyed the decapitation scenes as well. I thought that was such a fascinating breakdown. We've got a few questions coming in, so I'll be sure to read those out to you in a minute if you've got the time, Jane. Thank you again. Yeah, I just wanted to comment firstly that the decapitation scene, that was so interesting with the canopy you were describing there with the little end beast sort of showing. Yeah, do you know, that reminds me of hogback stones. It made me think of the sort of structure of that sort of arched. Yeah, so I'm keen to dig more into that in
Something that
yeah.
makes roof over the dead in one way or another, in the same way that a hogback with its roof does.
Yeah, yeah, interesting. Right, so I'll get to other questions that we've got. If you have any questions for Jane, please pop them into the chat and I will read those out. So our first one comes from Jack O'Hara, and there's been some comments on that question too, so bear with me while I read that out. So from Jack, does the small creature beneath a horse in the top panel, E1.4, represent a dog and suggests this panel is a hunting scene? Now, in response to Jack, Rebecca had written, I was assuming it might be a sacrifice. And Algae has also said, I thought it might be a lamb. So yeah, any comments on the potential of hunting, sacrifice? Yeah, from yourself, Jane.
Which picture are we actually talking?
E14. E1.4.
Sorry. Oh, right. Oh, yeah, that's underneath the procession. Yes. Okay.
Mm,
Well, he's in a procession going into war, and the dogs of war. What? It wouldn't surprise me if you had. Yes, here he is down on the bottom of that scene there, the muster, what I call the muster, and there
mhm,
you've got men with shields, all with shields and spears, and one dog at the bottom. And I don't think you necessarily go into a hunt all with shields. I don't think it's a hunting scene, but it's no that I mean the war dogs of war, they would bring dogs into battle, surely.
mm,
Um Absolutely, if you had your favorite dog, and the truth is about several of the Viking burials that they are buried with their dogs. That's really important for them.
mm.
So
Yeah, good point.
their dog was their trusty companion, their best friend.
Yeah, through the good times and the bad.
Yes.
Yes. From Jane Ann, we have the question. Interesting talk, thank you. Are there any other Pictish stones that include scenes that are possibly after a battle? I'm interested in the idea that there are depictions of lime kilns.
Oh, well, I can't find very many depictions of lime kilns, I must admit, because it's fairly um, mundane thing that they don't make carvings of absolutely everyday industrial processes, basically. So that's a kind of my weakest link, that there aren't pictures of lime kilns, but that's what they look like, and that's what they found at Tiso. Although they haven't got so much of the superstructure, they have got the shape of the kiln. Oh,
Thank you.
the foundations of it and the lime inside it.
Mm. Brilliant, thank you. Algae Alex has said, thanks a lot. That was very interesting. I really enjoyed the part with the severed heads. It made me think of this is a very common thing in the south of France, where I come from. It's a very big thing in southern archaeology for the same period of severed head, not of the enemies, but of the ancestors and important figures. An interesting point there, yes.
Well,
Um,
the cult of the head is a really important one throughout history, it seems, and in particularly with the Celts. I know in southern France, where they would sort of make monuments with the real skulls of the ancestors, and the conquered. And they appear so much in the both the poetry and the history of Irish sources and so on, that catching the man's head and taking the head with you as your trophy is
mm.
absolutely crucial to showing your desecration of your enemy.
Absolutely. I can see we've got lots of comments coming in saying thank you, and for a fascinating talk. Lots of things to think about. Fiona Campbell Howes has just shared with us as well. John Borland has a great presentation on warriors in Pictish sculpture, including warriors accompanied by little dogs, and shared a YouTube link with us. Thank you for that. I'm definitely going to be checking that out. Yeah, so I think that is all the questions for you. We've got lots of praise coming in. So thanks again, Jane, for presenting this evening. And thank you everybody for joining for our final seminar of the year. We have plenty scheduled in the upcoming year, so keep an eye on your emails. We'll be sure to send out details soon. Yeah, with that, I'll wish you all a good night. And thank you once again, Jane. That was a wonderful presentation. Take care, everybody, and have a great festive period.